Welcome to the 5-Week Linguist Show. If you want to learn a language or you teach a language, you've come to the right place. Join Janina each week for tips, resources, and advice for making engaging language learning happen anytime, anywhere.
Welcome to the 5-Week Linguist Show. We've been talking about the ACTFL 5 C's, so the 5 standards for learning and teaching languages. If you teach languages, you live this. And if you're learning a language, I think there's great takeaways for independent language learners here. So as a quick review, the 5 C's are communication, that's at the center of all of the standards, communities using the language, connections, culture, and comparisons. And that's what we're going to talk about this week is comparisons. I'm going to actually read you the definition right from the ACTFL website, and I'll link to it. So comparisons. Develop insight into the nature of language and culture in order to interact with cultural competence. In language comparisons, learners use the language to investigate, explain, and reflect on the nature of language through comparisons of the language studied and their own, and cultural comparisons. Learners use the language to investigate, explain, and reflect on the concept of culture through comparisons of the culture studied and their own. Now, I think if there's any one thing that we get from learning other languages is an acute awareness of our own language. And I know that's really it seems a bit lofty and nebulous, but if you think about even studying a language for a couple of years, you learn what a verb tense is. I mean, even if you might have an awareness of it, you don't really have a practical need to necessarily really, dig deep into that concept and understand different tenses and different grammar points. You don't need to know what an adjective is or an adverb is or a verb or a preposition to be able to communicate in a language. We know that. So that certainly comes second, but it certainly helps us learn our own. All of that interaction we do with language in really digging deep into meaning and to try to negotiate meaning helps us become better readers, better problem solvers. It helps us understand our own language in a way that we never would have before. I think it's also really important to note that, vocabulary, even we learn so much vocabulary through other languages. Now, my strong languages are Latin-based, and it seems even a few years of French and Spanish, those Latin-based languages, in English we use words that are our Latin-based language tends to be the sort of higher, more academic. So a really simple example would be the word for intelligent as opposed to smart. Intelligent is the more Latin-based words. Well, that's the equivalent that's the normal word in these other languages. So you learn so much vocabulary that you would never have had exposure to. And it can really help you learn lots of concepts. It's really great to see the bells go off. And it feels really rewarding myself. Wait a minute, what's that? And you just dig into language and you think, wow, I get it. And knowing a few basic, suffixes and prefixes and root words and being able to really quickly build vocabulary just by knowing those bits and pieces really helps us speak our own language and communicate in our own language with more effectively, right? The language, that awareness of language really gives us the tools to learn and apply the practical parts, whether we get any communicative function or not. And really interestingly is once we've gone through that struggle of learning another language as well as learning our own language, right? Learning, again, what those different parts of speech are, we can take all of that experience and bring it to another language and learn at warp speed, because we're not having to really think about, we understand these different bits and use that to ladder, not to mention the actual bits of language that we can use, those vocabulary connections. So Asian languages, usually you can, there's connections, similarities between, in vocabulary with some, Chinese and Korean and Japanese. And once you start kind of learning those patterns, it can really help you ladder and learn vocabulary really quickly. So for beginners, it's a great way to learn your own language. And then for those of us who are real enthusiasts, it's a great way to use that knowledge to learn other languages, right? Because we can kind of apply the same formulas in some ways and make rapid progress. I think another thing that's really great, the second standard, interculturality. That's about learning about the products, the practices, and perspectives through language. So as much as possible throughout the journey of language learning about the people, the practices, the products, the perspectives, to be able to interact with these cultures in a way that's appropriate, right? Because that can be really hard. But using culture to build language. So, for example, reading a French newspaper, right? Learning about what's going on in the world there today. Being able to read and use that language to really understand the people and make comparisons and really try to use that to build an understanding of people, right? So using that knowledge as a tool to understand and what's different and what's the same. I think at the end of the day, we're all people. We all have similar needs. We want to be accepted. We want to feel safe. But that looks a little different. We have some different norms in our cultures. And I would say some really practical ways to use this as a language learner would be find something of interest, right? I always think this too with the students, and this can be really challenging. I think it can be really difficult to do at first, finding things that are of interest. One source that I'd like to tell you about, I talk about it a lot, it's called Readlang. It's a Google extension, and it sort of turns your computer, your browser, into a language learning lab, a reading lab. But what's most powerful, apart from the tools, is that it feeds you a lot of suggestions. So newspapers, things that you just wouldn't have access to otherwise. I think that's the difficult part, is finding the access to these things. So I would definitely start there and start reading things that are of interest to you. And simply taking a notebook and noting what's the same and different as a language exercise. So using comparisons, this really important concept, this really important standard is all about making comparisons between this target language and our own language to make sense of both, right? And then using those tools to really dig deeper into language with authentic materials, right? Reading newspapers, reading magazines, reading blogs, reading comments on TripAdvisor, for example, in another language can really give you a good insight into everyday life of people in that target language, and really thinking about what's the same and what's different, and using that as a language exercise. And we know teachers, we design these activities all the time. It's something we think about all the time because we want people to understand what's the same and what's different, what to expect, so that they can function interculturally, so that they understand, for example, going to Spain, understand that the big meal is usually in the middle of the day and people eat a light meal at night. That's different. Your school day is going to look different than it does. You'll have a longer lunch break in many cases than you would if you lived in the United States, for example. So your steps, find something of interest. Don't be shy about learning grammar points in your language. Remember that all of that's going to help you master your language and help you master a new language. And use reading and audiovisual content and podcasts, right? Get that authentic content. Start with ReadLang, start with YouTube. It's going to feed you lots of suggestions to give you access to this new culture. Think about what's the same and different. Dig deep into the language and really examine and be able to talk about that. Develop talking about that in the target language. Oh, next week we're going to get into another one of the standards, and we'll talk then. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to the 5-Week Linguist Show with Janina Klimas. Join us each week here and visit us at reallifelanguage.com/reallifelanguageblog for more resources for learning and teaching languages.